Hello, everyone. Good to be with you again for our next session. So we are back on the theme of Exodus and looking at this lesson coming to us from the chapters of Acts 24, 5, and 6. And here we have Paul, who has hastily left Jerusalem by armed escort and is now in Caesarea, defending himself legally in front of the Roman governor on his way to Rome at some point. And so we're focusing on the theme of Exodus in the sense that Paul is following Jesus's example, and Jesus himself was portrayed by by Matthew in his gospel as being a new Moses and a new Joshua. And we've already talked about that in previous lessons, both in this quarter and in the previous quarter. So hopefully you understand what that means by this point. But as Matthew portrayed Jesus as a new Moses, he is Moses all the way up to the point when he is crucified and crucified outside of the city of Jerusalem, whereas Moses also died outside of the promised land. But then Jesus is resurrected as a symbolic new Joshua. Joshua received the conquest mission from Moses, and then as he almost completed it, handed that baton off to the remaining armies and told them to break apart and then go settle their allotments and continue the conquest by faith. So Jesus is telling his disciples to go and conquer the world because all authority in heaven and on earth is his, and go make disciples of the nations, right? So Paul is continuing on as the next generation of disciples, and he himself as an apostle, to go forth and conquer the nations, which he has been doing. But this Exodus that we're talking about in frame here is also keeping in mind the fact that the old order establishment of Israel and Jerusalem that has been this oppressive regime for the last 5 centuries, and of course is the oppressive regime that was the cause of Jesus's death, the very catalyst behind why he was crucified and how he was crucified, is about to be toppled. But there's some time left to pass before that happens. In fact, many more years from the time that Paul has been arrested now until eventually Jerusalem is laid siege to by Rome and then eventually toppled. So going here to the middle column, Yahweh vows to be with his man as the Exodus ensues. And by his man, I mean Moses in the original story, even Jesus in the various gospel stories that we have. And then, of course, Paul in the purple blocks. So reading this first orange one, and I'm not going to read all of these. I'm just going to read the first set of orange and purple and then summarize the rest of these so we can hopefully get done in 10 minutes. So the Lord in Exodus chapter 3, verse 12 tells Moses, I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I'm the one who sent you. You bring the people out of Egypt, you will come and worship on this mountain. The same thing with Paul. The following night after he was arrested, the Lord stood by him and he said, have courage. For as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, it's necessary for you to testify about me in Rome. As it was with Moses, I will be with you. So the Lord is essentially saying to Paul, as he is about to embark on this wilderness-like journey, I will be with you. A lot of uncertainty and variables ahead, but have courage. I will not abandon you. We go back to this first gray block, though, and back up a few verses in the Exodus 3 narrative, and we see some very striking language in comparison to what's being said in Acts 26, which is part of this corpus of literature that guides our lesson here. Because in Exodus chapter 3, this is what the Lord says. About midway through that block, I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians clearly being the oppressors in that story. But when we go to Acts chapter 26 and Paul is giving his story, he gives a much more expanded version of what we actually have in Acts chapter 9 when the Lord met Paul on the Damascus Road. Because in that moment, in verse 5 of chapter 9, this is all we have Jesus actually saying in that context. Paul asks, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. But get up, go into the city. You must be told what to do. But interestingly enough, this is what Paul has to say about the account when he's giving this testimony. And the Lord replied, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting, but get up and stand on your feet. Now this is where we get the expansion. For I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and a witness of all that you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your people and from the Gentiles. And I'm sending you to them to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and share among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So all of that too is Exodus language, as goes their deliverance. But notice the parallels here between I will rescue you. The Lord said to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, I will rescue my people from the oppressors, that being the Egyptians. And in this case, Matthew has painted the picture and is in full agreement with the other gospel writers too, that seem to hint at the very concept itself, as do other New Testament writers. Even John, writing the Apocalypse, or what we call Revelation, is hitting on this drum that the old order regime is the oppressive system that needs to come down and needs to be destroyed so that the new kingdom can flourish in its place. Because all of these people stand opposed to God's people and are acting violently toward them, even making martyrs of them. So notice when he says, first, I will rescue you from your people, which Paul has faced more vehemency from them than he actually has from the Gentiles, because the Jews are the only ones that are chasing him from city to city to harass him and even do things like stone him, and then incite the Gentile powers that be to try to take action against him as well. So in this case, the Jews are noted to be the oppressors of, again, God's people in the New Testament sense, and acting just like the Egyptians of old. So we have Paul in the same frame as both Moses and Jesus, being isolated here in such a way that people are trying to bring the powers that be against them for the sake of tearing them down and preventing their movement from actually being successful. Now, again, as I said before, I'm just going to summarize here what's in these other panels. We'll talk about that more when we finally get to that Wednesday night session. We get to unpack this. And so in the middle, orange and purple block, starting with the orange one, we have the false accusations being brought against Moses and Aaron by Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and this larger group of 250 people that essentially come to them and say, why then do you exalt yourselves above the Lord's assembly? And what this leads Moses to do then is to answer this with something of a challenge. But before I get to that, in Acts 24, we also have a false accusation being levied against Paul by a lawyer that the Jews have hired to litigate on their behalf against the Roman governor Felix up in Caesarea. And notice the inflammatory language here. We found him to be a plague, an agitator, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to desecrate the temple. So he apprehended him. And of course, all these things are completely false. So what we have Moses doing on the left side of the screen is putting this challenge forward. You come forward tomorrow with your censers. And of course, we'll see who the Lord honors as goes offering of sacrifice and prayer and so forth. And then we have Moses kind of acting a little angrily toward them as he's praying to the Lord, don't respect their offering. I've not taken anything from them. I just included that to explain the fact that he has not exploited his position of power in any way, shape, or form. Then Paul is also answering in chapter 24 of Acts this false argument against him and saying, essentially, the people who are responsible for these accusations should be coming forth to me and or presenting themselves here and making these things known and so on. But I want to draw attention to this first block of red text here, that this rejection of Moses essentially led to his embitterment that is patterned or played out when we get to Numbers 21, when he strikes the rock rather than speaking to it, which results to him dying outside the land. Now, the reason why I bring this up is to move to the final set of blocks, where we have in Luke 23, Jesus being brought forward for trial and Pilate saying to everyone, I find no cause for death. And essentially the people will not hear it. But just as Moses was put to death, as the Lord allowed him to die outside the land, we also understand Jesus was crucified, but the two links between that, or I should say crucified outside the land, i.e. the city of Jerusalem. But the two links there is that Moses was rejected, Jesus was rejected, and in this story panel, Paul is essentially being rejected. There's really no way to shape that because they don't want to listen to anything this man has to say. And his rejection actually leads him to his death at sea. But notice I have death in quotation marks. Of course, Paul is going to die by beheading at the hands of Nero and his command. But what I mean to illustrate by that is the fact that Paul very closely comes to death as he was tossed into the sea by virtue of the fact he was on a ship transporting him to Rome, and then that ship suffered shipwreck. And then Paul nearly died with many of the others who were imperiled at sea with him. But thankfully, the Lord rescued him from all of that. But the big picture here is in Scripture, the sea is always considered to be a part of the abyss in the sense that it's an extension of the grave. It's the conduit by which people will slip down into the dark, murky waters and eventually wind up in Sheol. So the idea is that by him being tossed into the sea like this, as goes whole Bible theology, it's a very clear and ominous picture of death. Think of Moses being tossed into the Nile River along with all of those other boys, and they died, but yet he was saved. by the deliverance that God wrought for him. The same thing here with Paul, and of course, the same thing with Jesus. He went through the murky waters of death, but emerged victorious on the other side. And the same thing here with Paul. So he's following in the vein of these great leaders of the faith, and of course, the Messiah, Jesus, who stands at the top of this mountain. But it's important for us to recognize there's a pattern here that we too are supposed to follow. And that's something we'll talk about on the Wednesday night session. So hopefully that has been helpful. Thanks for listening.